The mansion loomed like a fortress, its towering walls casting a long shadow over the sprawling grounds. It was a kind of home most people could only dream of: gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the unmistakable scent of wealth that hung in the air. But for all its beauty, there was an emptiness within these walls that no amount of money could fill. And at the heart of that emptiness were three children, the billionaire triplets, Daniel, Ava, and Caleb. 18 nannies had come and gone in just 3 months. 18. Each one left with the same broken expression, their spirits crushed under the weight of the triplets' defiance. They were called impossible. Demon children. No one could handle them. No one could understand them. They broke hearts and shattered dreams with every tantrum, every cruel word, every act of rebellion. The triplets were born into a world of luxury, their father a powerful billionaire with an empire that stretched across continents. Yet, for all the riches, they were lost. They had everything, except love, understanding, and the one thing they needed the most, a sense of belonging. Daniel, the eldest, was a puzzle wrapped in anger. His eyes, dark as the night sky, were always narrowed, as though he was waiting for someone to betray him. He never smiled. He never let anyone in. He was the kind of boy who could sit in a room full of people and make you feel like the loneliest person on earth. He never spoke unless it was to demand something, and even then, his words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Ava, the middle child, was wild, untamed, and unpredictable. She was a force of nature, full of energy and fire, but also a volcano ready to erupt. She threw tantrums that would make the walls shake, slamming doors and yelling at the top of her lungs. Her rebellious nature made her a nightmare for anyone who tried to control her. She refused to be anyone's puppet, and she let everyone know it. But beneath her defiance was a deep sadness, a brokenness that no one ever saw. She pushed everyone away because she feared they would leave her, just like everyone else had. Caleb, the youngest, was quieter than his siblings, but his silence spoke volumes. His eyes were full of hurt, a pain that seemed too heavy for his small body to carry. He didn't yell. He didn't throw tantrums. Instead, he withdrew into himself, retreating to his room, sitting alone in the dark, and staring out the window at the world he felt disconnected from. His anger simmered beneath the surface, and no one had yet found a way to reach him. The mansion had become a battlefield, a place where every attempt at connection was met with rejection, and every effort to calm the storm was crushed under the weight of their collective pain. The staff whispered about the children. Some said they were cursed. Others said they were just spoiled, raised with too much money and not enough love. But no one ever asked why. No one ever wondered what was really going on behind their eyes. It was then that Juliet walked into their lives. Juliet had no idea what she was getting herself into when she answered the ad for the job. She had heard of the billionaire triplets. Of course, everyone had. Their reputation was legendary. But Juliet wasn't afraid. She had lived through far worse. Raised in a rough neighborhood, she had seen her fair share of pain. She had lost her parents at a young age and had spent years navigating a world that had little to offer someone like her. She had survived abuse, neglect, and loss. But through it all, she had never lost her ability to love. She walked into the mansion that first day with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet determination. She wasn't here for the money. She wasn't here for the fame or the luxury. She was here to make a difference. And deep down, she knew she had the strength to do it. But when she met the triplets for the first time, she wasn't sure where to begin. Daniel was the first to greet her. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes studying her with a cold, calculating look. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched her, waiting for her to prove that she wouldn't be like the others. Ava was next. She burst into the room with a loud bang, slamming the door behind her. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes wild and full of defiance. She looked Juliet up and down, sneered, and then turned on her heel without a word. She didn't care who this new person was. She wasn't going to let anyone tell her what to do. Caleb, the quiet one, watched from a distance. He didn't come forward like the others. He didn't make his presence known. But Juliet could feel his eyes on her, and she could sense the loneliness radiating off him like a heavy cloak. He didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge her presence. but she could tell he was there, and he was watching. Juliet didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She smiled gently, but she didn't try to force anything. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with broken hearts wasn't with force. It was with patience, understanding, and love. For the first few days, the triplets tested her. They pushed her. They ignored her. They tried to break her, just as they had broken every other nanny before her. Daniel refused to speak to her. Ava threw tantrums when Juliet didn't give in to her every demand. Caleb stayed in his room, retreating further and further into his shell. But Juliet wasn't like the others. She didn't give up. She didn't walk away. One evening, after another long day of trying and failing to get the triplets to behave, Juliet found herself in the garden, sitting on a bench under the stars. The cool night air calmed her, but also reminded her of the storm she was facing inside the mansion. She was tired. She was frustrated, and she felt a pang of doubt creep into her heart. What if she couldn't do this? What if she wasn't strong enough? It was then that she heard footsteps. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. And then a voice, gentle, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry." Juliet looked up to see Daniel standing there, his head lowered. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then he spoke again. "I didn't mean to. I don't know why I just want things to be different." Juliet's heart softened. She stood up slowly, walking toward him, not saying anything. She didn't need to. She just stood there, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel looked up at her, his eyes full of vulnerability. "You don't have to be perfect, Daniel. You just have to try." It was the first time someone had told him that he didn't have to be perfect. The first time someone had told him that it was okay to be broken, to be flawed. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to fix everything. But for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. And that was the beginning. The beginning of a journey that would take all of them down a path of healing, of understanding, of love. A journey that would change the triplets, and Juliet forever. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion and frustration. Juliet was no stranger to difficult people, but the triplets were a puzzle like no other. Daniel, Ava, and Caleb were more than just children with bad attitudes. They were like walls, impenetrable and unyielding, pushing away anyone who tried to get close. The mansion was still vast and intimidating, its halls echoing with the sounds of silence as the triplets kept to themselves. Juliet felt the weight of her new role pressing on her. Every time she entered their rooms, she was met with cool stares, sarcastic remarks, or complete indifference. Nothing she did seemed to make a difference. But Juliet wasn't one to give up. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had a fire in her that told her she could change things. She'd had to fight for her own survival in the past. She wasn't about to let these children get the best of her now. It was a quiet afternoon when the first real interaction happened. Julia had spent hours in the kitchen, preparing the triplets' favorite meal, hoping to break the ice. As she placed the plates on the dining table, she could feel their eyes on her, watching her every move. Daniel was sitting at the end of the table, his expression unreadable. He stared at the food with the same disinterest he'd shown everything else. Ava sat beside him, tapping her fingers impatiently on the edge of her plate. Caleb, the youngest, had his head down, his eyes fixed on the table, as if trying to disappear into the surface. Juliet smiled softly as she set down the last plate, hoping for some sort of acknowledgement. She sat down, waiting for them to say something. But it was Daniel who broke the silence first, his voice low and filled with barely contained anger. "I don't want to eat this," he muttered, pushing the plate away. "I want something else." Ava snorted, rolling her eyes. "Yeah, like you always do. Nothing ever makes you happy." She turned to Juliet with a scowl. "You think cooking for us is going to change anything? It won't." Juliet looked at them, all three of them looking back at her, with a mix of challenge and pain in their eyes. She took a deep breath, fighting the urge to back down, to walk away. She had to show them that she wasn't like the others. "How about this?" Juliet said, her voice calm but firm. "If you don't like the food, then we'll figure out something else. But we're going to sit here and eat together. No more running away. No more avoiding each other. Daniel's eyes narrowed. You think you can change us with some stupid dinner? You don't know anything about us. Juliet's smile remained unchanged. I may not know everything about you, Daniel, but I know that food doesn't solve problems. But sitting together, sharing a meal, that might just be a start. Ava huffed, but didn't argue. Caleb, on the other hand, looked at Juliet for the first time, his gaze softening ever so slightly. He didn't speak, but the tiniest hint of curiosity flickered in his eyes. Juliet saw it, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Over the next few days, Juliet worked hard to build a connection with the triplets. She didn't push too hard, but she didn't give up either. Every morning, she greeted them with a smile, no matter how cold they were. Every night, she insisted on sitting down for dinner, even if it meant eating in silence. She didn't force conversation, but she never let them shut her out. One afternoon, Juliet found herself walking to the mansion's expansive garden, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the soft grass beneath her feet. She had learned that the triplets often retreated to the garden when they were upset, and she had begun to make it a habit to walk through it every day. She knew they would eventually come to her if they needed her. She was right. As she walked past the rows of carefully tended flowers, she saw Caleb sitting on a bench, his legs tucked up under him, staring at the ground. He didn't notice her at first, and Juliet took a moment to observe him. His face was unreadable, but there was something about the way his shoulders hunched in on themselves, the way he seemed so small despite his age, that tugged at her heart. She approached him quietly, sitting on the bench beside him. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence, but Juliet didn't mind. She simply sat there, offering him her company, her silence. Minutes passed before Caleb finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on the ground. "Everyone else leaves." Juliet's heart ached as she looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb," she said gently. "I'm here to help, to stay. You don't have to be alone." Caleb didn't respond, but his posture seemed to soften just a little. The air between them wasn't charged with the usual hostility. It felt like a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. Juliet wasn't sure if this was progress or just a momentary shift, but it felt important. "Do you like it here?" he asked after a while, his voice still quiet but a little less guarded. Juliet paused, thinking, "It's not about where I am, Caleb. It's about who I'm with. And right now I'm with you. And that's enough for me." For the first time, Caleb looked at her. His eyes were still clouded with uncertainty, but there was a faint flicker of something, maybe trust, maybe hope. Juliet wasn't sure, but it was enough for her to know that he was starting to see her. Ava, too, began to show signs of softening, though in her own way. One afternoon, as Juliet was sitting in the living room, Ava stormed in, her eyes blazing with anger. Juliet didn't react. She had learned that Ava's rage wasn't just a defense mechanism. It was a cry for help, a sign that she needed someone to break through her walls. "Why do you even care?" Ava snapped, glaring at Juliet. "You think you can fix us? We're not broken." Juliet met her gaze steadily, her expression calm. "You're not broken, Ava, but you're hurting. And it's okay to admit that. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Ava's scowl deepened, but she didn't storm out this time. She stayed. And in that silence, Juliet knew she had made a tiny dent in Ava's defenses. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. By the end of the week, something had shifted in the mansion. The triplets didn't magically change overnight, but they were beginning to open up bit by bit. Juliet had made her presence known, not by forcing her way into their lives, but by simply being there, being consistent, being patient, and offering the one thing they had never experienced enough of: unconditional love. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start, and Juliet knew that this was just the beginning. The days that followed were both a challenge and a revelation for Juliet. The triplets, though showing slight cracks in their tough exteriors, still made every interaction a test of patience. They were stubborn, rebellious, and filled with anger that seemed to have no source. It was as if they were drowning in their own emotions and pushing away any attempt to help them. But Juliet wasn't about to be discouraged. She had learned that sometimes the most difficult battles were the ones that were worth fighting. Each morning, Juliet started the day by gently waking them up. It was always a challenge to get them out of bed. Daniel, who was always the first to wake up, usually sat silently by the window, staring out at the vast grounds of the mansion. Ava, on the other hand, could never be on time, and she often threw tantrums about getting up. Caleb, the quiet one, would remain in his bed, his body curled into a ball, refusing to move. But Juliet persisted. She would sit at their door, offering a kind word or a gentle nudge, try to break through their defenses. Daniel often ignored her, but occasionally he would allow her to sit with him in silence. Ava would snap and scream, but Juliet would calmly walk away, only to return an hour later, still unshaken. Caleb was the trickiest of them all. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was always in the softest of whispers, as if his voice might shatter the world around him. But Juliet wasn't afraid of their silence. She didn't take their anger personally. She knew they were not angry at her. They were angry at the world, at the way their lives had been turned upside down, at the absence of a mother's love, and the overwhelming expectations placed on them by their father. It was late one afternoon when Juliet realized just how deep the pain went. She had been trying to help Caleb with his homework. He was struggling with math, but his resistance was more than just frustration with the subject. He had been quiet for the last few days, barely speaking a word. When Juliet sat beside him and tried to encourage him, Caleb pushed the book away and stared at the floor. "I don't care," he muttered, his voice flat and void of emotion. Juliet's heart broke as she watched him. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply stayed with him, her presence a quiet reassurance. She didn't try to force him to speak. She didn't try to solve the problem for him. She just sat there. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb finally looked up at her. His eyes were filled with an ocean of unspoken words. "I don't want to be here," he whispered. "I don't want to be with any of you." Juliet didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, understanding. She reached out and gently touched his hand, offering him comfort in a way that words couldn't express. "You don't have to want to be here, Caleb. You don't have to want anything right now. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Caleb didn't say anything more, but the slight loosening of his shoulders, the way his body stopped feeling so tense, was enough. It was a small victory, but it was one that Juliet knew would mean more than anything. She had made a connection with him, one that went deeper than any academic achievement or forced smile. Meanwhile, Ava continued to test Juliet's patience. She was always full of energy, but it was the kind of energy that was fueled by anger. Ava's rebellion was obvious in everything she did. She refused to follow any rules, constantly pushed boundaries, and challenged everything Juliet did. It wasn't unusual for her to storm out of the house without explanation, only to return hours later with no apologies or explanations. She didn't care what anyone thought. One afternoon, Juliet found herself standing in front of Ava's door, wondering if this time would be any different. Ava had locked herself in again, her defiance growing with each passing day. Juliet knocked gently on the door, but Ava's voice came through the wood, sharp and angry. "Go away. I don't need you here." Juliet sighed softly, her hand resting on the doorknob. She knew Ava was only pushing her away because she feared getting too close. She had seen it before. Children who push people away because they didn't know how to trust. But Juliet wasn't going to give up on her. "Ava, I'm not going anywhere," Juliet said, her voice calm. "You can shut me out as much as you want, but I'm still here, and I'm not leaving." There was a long silence before Ava finally responded. She didn't speak, but Juliet could hear the soft rustling of the door as Ava unlocked it from the inside. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than anything. Juliet gently opened the door, and Ava was sitting on the floor, her back to the wall. She had stopped fighting. She was just sitting there, looking at the floor, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Juliet didn't say anything. She simply sat down beside her. "You don't have to say anything," Juliet said after a long pause. "I know you're angry, but I'm here, and you don't have to face this alone." Ava didn't respond. She didn't yell or scream like she usually did. Instead, She allowed the silence to settle between them. And for the first time, Juliet saw the cracks in Ava's walls, the raw pain, the loneliness, and the fear of being abandoned again. Ava had been pushing people away for so long because she didn't know how to let anyone in. It wasn't a breakthrough. Not yet, but it was progress. And that was enough for Juliet. It was in the quiet moments that Juliet began to realize the true nature of the challenge she faced. The triplets weren't just acting out for the sake of attention. They were broken. Each of them carried their own scars, their own fears, and their own pain. The walls they had built around themselves weren't just defenses. They were shields against the hurt they had never been allowed to heal from. Juliet knew it would take time. She knew that the road ahead would be filled with moments of frustration and setbacks. But she was beginning to understand that this wasn't about fixing them. It wasn't about making them perfect. It was about showing them that they were worthy of love, that they didn't have to be alone in their pain, and that they could trust someone again. She was their nanny, but in many ways, she was also their lifeline. As the week went on, Juliet began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the mansion. The triplets were still difficult, still unpredictable, but they weren't quite as distant. Daniel, who had barely spoken to her at all, began to acknowledge her presence in small ways. He would nod when she asked him a question, or glance at her with a look that wasn't quite as cold as before. Ava still tested her at every turn, but the anger in her eyes was beginning to soften just slightly. And Caleb, though still silent, was beginning to seek her out when he needed someone. He wasn't as withdrawn as he once was. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Days turned into weeks, and Juliet's patience continued to be tested. The mansion was quieter now, but the silence felt different. It wasn't oppressive or cold. It was a kind of silence that hinted at something changing, something shifting beneath the surface. The triplets were still difficult, still angry, still resistant. But there were moments, small moments, where Juliet could see a flicker of something else. A crack in their tough exteriors. A glimpse of hope. One evening, after dinner, Juliet found herself sitting in the living room, quietly reading a book. She was trying to take some time for herself, but the noise from upstairs quickly shattered her peace. The sound of something being thrown, followed by loud shouting, echoed through the house. Ava, again. Juliet sighed and set the book down. She didn't need to ask what was happening. She knew. Ava's tantrums had become more frequent in the past few days, fueled by a frustration that seemed to come out of nowhere. Juliet had learned not to confront her head-on. Not yet. Ava wasn't ready for that kind of confrontation. Instead, Juliet calmly walked upstairs and stood outside Ava's door, listening to the chaos inside. There was no screaming now, just the sound of furniture being overturned, followed by the quiet thud of something hitting the wall. Juliet took a deep breath and gently knocked on the door. Ava, no surprise, didn't answer. She never did when she was in the middle of one of her rages. But Juliet wasn't about to back down. She knocked again, this time louder, her voice steady as she called out, "Ava, it's me, Juliet. I know you're in there. You don't have to do this alone. Please, just let me in." There was a long silence before Juliet heard the faintest sound, the shuffle of feet, followed by a soft click as the door unlocked. Juliet didn't wait. She slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. Ava was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hair, once neatly styled, now hung in wild tangles around her face. She looked like a completely different person from the confident, rebellious girl Juliet had met when she first arrived. In that moment, Ava wasn't the angry child who had pushed everyone away. She was just a girl who had been hurt for so long that she didn't know how to heal. Juliet sat down beside her, close but not too close. She didn't try to touch her or comfort her with empty words. Instead, she simply waited, letting the silence speak for itself. "I don't want to be like this," Ava whispered after what felt like forever. "I don't know why I am." Juliet nodded, her heart aching as she looked at Ava, so vulnerable in that moment. "You don't have to be like this. Ava, you don't have to carry all this on your own. I'm here for you." Ava's eyes flickered to her for the briefest of moments before she quickly looked away. She didn't want to admit how badly she needed someone. She didn't want to be the one who was broken. She didn't want to let Juliet in. But Juliet didn't give up. She stayed there, offering her quiet presence, knowing that Ava wasn't ready to talk yet. Sometimes words weren't needed. Sometimes just being there was enough. After a while, Ava sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She didn't say anything, but Juliet could feel the change. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Ava was starting to trust her. "I'm not going to leave you," Juliet said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." While Ava's breakthrough was subtle, Daniel's was anything but. One afternoon, Juliet found herself in the library. Tried to catch up on some work when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned around to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was glaring at her, but there was something in his eyes that told her this wasn't the usual defiance. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice colder than usual. Juliet looked at him, her expression calm. "I was just reading, Daniel, but it looks like you have something to say." Daniel stood still for a moment, the silence between them growing thick. He looked like he was debating whether to walk away or stay. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice barely audible. "You think you can change us? You think you can fix everything by just being here?" Juliet didn't flinch at his words. She had heard worse. She had faced worse. She stood up slowly and walked toward him, her gaze steady. "No, Daniel, I don't think I can change everything, but I do think I can be here for you. And that's a start." Daniel looked at her for a long time, his eyes filled with confusion, anger, and maybe something else. He didn't say anything more, but when he finally turned and walked away, Juliet felt a shift in the air. It was a small change, but it was a change. Daniel had let her in, even if it was only for a moment. Caleb was the quietest of the triplets, but in some ways, that made him the hardest to reach. He didn't throw tantrums like Ava or lash out like Daniel. Instead, he withdrew into himself, shutting everyone out. Juliet knew that he carried a weight inside him, something deeper than the anger he was too afraid to express. And it was that quiet, hidden pain that Juliet was determined to reach. One evening, after dinner, Juliet found Caleb sitting on the edge of the porch, his legs dangling over the side as he stared out into the darkness. The sky above was clear, the stars twinkling like distant diamonds. Caleb didn't notice her at first, but when she walked up beside him, he looked at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "You're not going to make me talk, are you?" he asked, his voice soft but guarded. Juliet smiled softly, sitting down beside him, not too close but just enough to show him that she was there. "No, Caleb, I'm not going to make you talk. I'm just here to listen. If you ever want to..." Caleb looked away, his hands tightening around the edge of the porch. He didn't say anything for a long time, but Juliet could tell he was processing her words. He wasn't ready to open up, not yet. But for the first time, he didn't push her away. He didn't retreat into silence. He stayed there with her, just sitting in the quiet of the night. As the days passed, Juliet began to see more of the triplets' true selves. They were still angry, still filled with pain, but the walls they had built around themselves were beginning to crack. Daniel, Ava, and Caleb were starting to see that they didn't have to be alone, that they didn't have to carry their pain by themselves anymore. The healing wasn't going to happen overnight. Juliet knew that, but she had hope, and hope was a powerful thing. The days had turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Juliet saw subtle changes in triplets. The walls they had built were not falling all at once. They were crumbling piece by piece, and each piece represented something deep, something raw. Juliet had spent so long trying to connect with them, but it had only been through their silent acceptance that the real healing began. There was still a long way to go, but Juliet could see that things were slowly beginning to shift in the mansion. It was Daniel who made the first real breakthrough. He had been the most resistant, the most closed off, and the most hostile toward Juliet. His silence had been his armor, his way of shutting everyone out. But Juliet didn't push. She allowed him the space he needed. She didn't try to force him to talk or to express himself. Instead, she just stayed, offering him consistency and warmth. It had been a month since she first arrived, and though Daniel still spent much of his time alone, there were moments when he began to seek her out. One evening, Juliet was in the garden, tending to the flowers she had planted a few weeks ago. It had become her ritual, a time to reflect and clear her mind. She had noticed that the triplets sometimes came outside when they needed to be alone, and she had learned to respect that space. But as she knelt down to water the roses, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Turning around, she saw Daniel walking toward her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression as guarded as ever. Juliet didn't say anything at first. She simply waited, watching him as he approached. "I need your help," he said suddenly, his voice low and hesitant. It was the first time he had ever asked for anything from her. Juliet stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what he needed, but the fact that he was asking, really asking, was enough. "What do you need, Daniel?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Daniel hesitated for a moment, looking away. "I'm failing. At everything. In school and life. I'm just not good enough." Juliet's heart ached as she watched him struggle with his words. He was opening up, but only just barely. She stepped closer to him, her voice soft. "You're not failing, Daniel. You're just going through something, and it doesn't make you any less a person. Everyone feels lost sometimes. The important thing is that you're not alone. I'm here to help you, but you have to let me." Daniel's eyes flickered with something, vulnerability, fear, maybe even shame, but he quickly looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix myself." "You don't need to fix anything, Daniel," Juliet said gently. "You just need to try. And that's enough." Daniel stared at the ground, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. For a moment, Juliet thought he might turn and walk away, but instead, he finally looked at her again, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hope. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe I can try." It wasn't long after that moment that Juliet saw a significant change in Daniel. He still struggled, still pushed people away, but the harshness in his eyes began to soften. He started spending more time outside, sometimes sitting beside Juliet as she worked in the garden. He didn't say much, but the silence between them was no longer tense. It was comfortable, like they were beginning to understand each other, without needing words. Ava, too, was changing, though in her own way. Her anger, which had always been so obvious, was beginning to lose some of its edge. She was still as fiery as ever, still as quick to lash out, but there was a subtle difference in how she responded to Juliet. It wasn't much, but Ava had started to let her guard down, even if it was just a little bit at a time. One day, Juliet found Ava sitting on the steps outside the house, her legs crossed and her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Juliet didn't approach her at first. She simply sat at the edge of the steps, a few feet away, not pushing, just being there. After a long pause, Ava finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her tone soft but tinged with confusion. "Why do you keep trying with us?" Juliet glanced at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Because I believe in you, Ava. I believe that you're more than just your anger. I believe that you have the strength to change, and I'm here to help you, no matter how long it takes." Ava looked at her, her eyes searching for something, for honesty, for truth. After a moment, she shook her head, but there was no anger in her movement, only the slightest hint of uncertainty. "I don't know if I can change," she whispered. "You don't have to change all at once," Juliet said gently. "You just have to take the first step, and I'll be here to help you with every step after that." Ava didn't say anything more, but she didn't walk away either. It was a small shift, a small victory. But for Juliet, it was a sign that Ava was finally starting to trust her. Caleb was the hardest to reach. He was quiet, withdrawn, and often seemed lost in his own world. Juliet had spent weeks trying to connect with him, but he rarely spoke, and when he did, it was always in soft, hesitant whispers. He was a mystery, so different from his siblings, yet so much the same. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Juliet found Caleb sitting by the window in the living room, staring out into the distance. His expression was blank, but Juliet could see the sadness in his eyes. She approached him quietly, sitting down beside him without saying a word. They sat together in the silence, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not like them. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be like them." Juliet looked at him, her heart aching. "You don't have to be like them, Caleb. You just need to be yourself. You don't need to fix anything. You just need to know that it's okay to feel how you feel." Caleb turned to her, his eyes wide with surprise. "You really mean that?" Juliet nodded, smiling gently. "Yes, Caleb, I do. And I'm here for you. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." For the first time, Caleb didn't pull away. He didn't hide behind his walls. He simply looked at her, as if he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could trust her. The triplets weren't healed yet. They weren't fixed. They were still struggling, still angry, still broken in many ways. But Juliet knew that the real healing had begun. They were starting to open up, starting to trust, and starting to see that they didn't have to face their pain alone. Juliet had always known that love was powerful, but seeing it in action, seeing it break through the toughest walls, seeing it restore broken hearts, was something she would never forget. And in that moment, Juliet knew that she was exactly where she needed to be. The mansion had never felt so alive. It wasn't the loud, chaotic kind of life that came from constant noise, but rather the quiet, subtle kind, the kind that crept into your heart and made you believe that maybe things could get better. Juliet had worked hard to build trust with the triplets, and though there were still plenty of challenges, the atmosphere had begun to change. The walls they had built around themselves were still standing, but they were no longer as impenetrable. Juliet had learned that healing wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about saying the right words or fixing everything all at once. It was about showing up over and over again, even when the walls went up, even when they pushed her away. The little things mattered the most. The quiet moments, the soft smiles, the patience that spoke louder than any words could. And it was in those little things that Juliet started to see the real progress, the true changes in the triplets. One morning, Juliet was sitting in the kitchen, preparing breakfast when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around and know who it was. She could tell by the way the floorboards creaked under the weight of their steps. Daniel was standing in the doorway, looking uncertain, as though he wasn't quite sure what to do next. Juliet smiled without saying a word, and after a long pause, Daniel spoke. "Can you make me something different for breakfast today?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Just something simple. Juliet didn't hesitate. "Of course, Daniel. What would you like?" He shifted uncomfortably, his usual defensiveness gone. "I don't know. Just surprise me." It was a small request, but it felt like a breakthrough. Daniel wasn't demanding. He wasn't pushing her away. He was asking, in his own way, for something he needed, and Juliet was more than happy to give it to him. She began preparing a simple breakfast, the familiar hum of the kitchen filling the space between them. Daniel didn't sit down at the table. He stood by the counter, watching as Juliet worked, his eyes softening just slightly. For the first time in a long while, Juliet felt like she was truly connecting with him, even without words. She didn't force a conversation. She simply let the silence settle between them. When the food was ready, she placed a plate in front of him, and Daniel looked down at it with the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He didn't thank her, didn't say much at all, but Juliet could see the change in him. He wasn't the same angry boy who had barely acknowledged her existence. He wasn't perfect, not by any means, but he was trying. Ava, too, had begun to show her softer side. She was still fiery, still unpredictable, but Juliet could see the subtle changes in her behavior. One afternoon, as Juliet was working in the garden, she noticed Ava sitting on the porch, her gaze distant and unfocused. Juliet took a deep breath, deciding that now was as good a time as any to approach her. "Ava, are you okay?" Juliet asked softly, walking over to her. Ava didn't answer right away. She simply stared out into the distance, her legs stretched out in front of her. It was clear she was lost in thought, but for once, she didn't seem angry. She didn't seem ready to fight. "I'm fine," Ava replied after a while, but there was something different in her voice. It wasn't the usual sharpness. It wasn't the usual rebellion. It was quieter, softer. Juliet sat down beside her, offering the space she needed. She didn't try to push, didn't try to get her to talk. She simply sat with her, letting the silence stretch on. Ava didn't look at her, but Juliet could feel the change in the air. There was no anger, no hostility, just two people sitting together, existing in the same space. "You're not alone, Ava," Juliet said gently, breaking the silence. "I'm here for you, no matter what." Ava's eyes flickered toward her for a brief moment, but she didn't respond. Juliet didn't need a response. She could see that Ava was listening, that Ava was starting to believe her. Caleb, the quietest of the triplets, had always been the hardest to reach. He wasn't as outwardly angry as his siblings, but his silence spoke volumes. Juliet had always known that his pain ran deep, and she had done everything she could to meet him where he was, offering her presence without forcing him to speak. One evening, after dinner, Juliet found herself walking down the hallway when she saw Caleb standing in front of his bedroom door. He wasn't going inside. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just standing there, staring at the door as if he was unsure whether to enter or not. Juliet stopped a few feet away, her gaze softening as she watched him. She didn't say anything at first. She just waited. "Caleb, do you need help with anything?" Juliet asked gently. He didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Can I stay out here for a little while?" he asked quietly. "Of course, Caleb. You can stay out here as long as you need to," Juliet replied, her tone reassuring. He nodded and stepped aside, sitting down on the floor by the door. Juliet sat beside him, not saying anything at first. She wasn't sure what was going on in his mind, but she could tell that he was feeling something, a mixture of sadness, fear, and maybe even relief. They sat in silence for a while, with Juliet offering nothing but her presence. She didn't try to make him talk. She didn't try to push him. She simply sat beside him, letting him know that he didn't have to be alone. After a long time, Caleb finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it better." "You don't have to fix anything, Caleb," Juliet said softly. "You just have to be, and that's enough." For the first time, Caleb didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into his silence. He simply stayed there with her, and that was enough for both of them. The triplets weren't perfect. They weren't completely healed. But Juliet could see the progress they were making, even in the smallest of moments. It wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic breakthroughs that mattered most. It was the little things. The quiet moments when they chose to let their guard down. The moments when they realized they didn't have to be angry, broken, or alone. Love, Juliet had learned, wasn't always about fixing the problems. Sometimes it was just about showing up, being patient, and offering unconditional support. And with every little thing she did, Juliet was showing the triplets that they were worth the effort, that they were worth the love. Just when Juliet thought they were beginning to make progress, a setback hit like a storm. The triplets had shown signs of vulnerability, of opening up, and for the first time, Juliet began to feel like they might be on the path to healing. But change, as she soon learned, wasn't linear. It wasn't a smooth road. It was full of bumps, twists, and turns that could take everything backwards in an instant. It started with Daniel. For weeks, he had been quieter, more introspective. He still kept his distance, but had allowed Juliet to be part of his world in small ways, sitting with him in the garden while she worked, occasionally joining her at the dinner table, and even giving her a hesitant smile now and then. It was a soft, subtle change, but it was a change. One afternoon, Juliet was sitting in the library when she heard the sound of running footsteps down the hallway. Before she could stand up to see what was happening, the door to the library burst open, and Daniel stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "I hate this place," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "I hate everything about it." Juliet stood up slowly, her heart racing. Daniel had never exploded like this before. He had always been guarded, always keeping his emotions bottled up. This outburst was something entirely new, and Juliet could feel the intensity in the air. "Daniel, what's going on?" she asked softly, her voice calm but firm. His eyes flashed with something. Frustration, fear, maybe even guilt, but he didn't answer. He paced back and forth in the library, his fists clenched at his sides, his breathing heavy. For a moment, Juliet didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to reach him when he was this far gone, when the walls he let down just days ago were rising up again, stronger than ever. "I'm not like you," he spat, his voice harsh. "I'm not like Ava. I'm not like Caleb. I'm just a mistake." "Daniel," Juliet said, stepping forward carefully, "you're not a mistake. You never were. But you're hurting, and I know you're scared." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Scared? Of what?" "Of everything," Juliet answered softly. "Of feeling like you're not enough. Of thinking that you have to be perfect. But you don't. You don't have to be perfect, Daniel. You just have to be yourself." For a long moment, Daniel didn't speak. He simply stared at her, his chest rising and falling with each breath. It was as if he was trying to figure out whether or not he could trust her, whether he could let her in again. But then, as quickly as the storm had come, it was gone. Daniel's shoulders slumped, and he walked past her without another word. Juliet stood there, watching him retreat, her heart heavy with the weight of his pain. She knew this wasn't over. It wasn't the breakthrough she had hoped for. It was a step backward, a reminder that healing was messy, that it wasn't always a straight line. Later that evening, Ava, as unpredictable as ever, confronted Juliet in the hallway. She had seen the exchange between Juliet and Daniel, and as always, she wasn't shy about expressing her thoughts. "What did you say to him?" Ava demanded, her eyes flashing with suspicion. "He's been like that all day, and I don't know why." Juliet took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "I didn't say anything wrong. Ava, he's struggling, and sometimes people need space to figure things out on their own." "Space?" Ava scoffed. "What good is space? What good is any of this? Nothing ever changes. It's just the same cycle over and over again." "Ava, I know you're frustrated. I can see that. But pushing everyone away won't make it better. You're not alone, and neither is Daniel or Caleb." Ava shook her head, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really think you can fix us, don't you? You really think that with enough time and enough of your help, we're all just going to magically change? That we're going to suddenly be happy?" Juliet didn't react to the sarcasm. She knew Ava was angry because she didn't know how to trust, angry because she was scared. "Ava, I don't expect you to change overnight, but I'm not going anywhere no matter how angry you are. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to trust me. But I'm here and I'm not leaving." Ava didn't say anything more. She just walked past Juliet, disappearing into her room. But Juliet could see the faintest tremor in her steps. Ava wasn't as sure of herself as she pretended to be. There was fear behind the defiance, sadness behind the anger. Juliet had seen it in her eyes before, and she knew it was still there. As for Caleb, he had grown more distant since Daniel's outburst. He didn't throw tantrums or yell like Ava, but he withdrew even further into himself, retreating into the shadows of his room. Juliet had learned to be patient with him, but the silence between them had become unbearable. She could feel his pain, but every attempt to reach him was met with cold indifference. One evening, as the sun began to set, Juliet found Caleb sitting by the large bay window, staring out into the garden. His posture was stiff, and his expression was unreadable. Juliet hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was the right time to approach him. "Caleb," she said quietly, sitting down beside him. "What's going on?" He didn't answer at first, but Juliet could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped his hands together, his knuckles white. He had been through so much, and yet he had never spoken about it. He had never shared what was really eating at him. "I don't know how to fix this," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be normal, how to be happy." "Caleb, you don't have to be normal," Juliet said gently. "You just have to be yourself. And that's more than enough." He looked at her for the first time in what felt like forever, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Do you really mean that?" "Yes, Caleb, I do," Juliet replied. "You're not broken. You're not a mistake. You're just someone who's been hurt, and you're allowed to heal at your own pace." Caleb didn't say anything else, but Juliet could see a shift in him. The walls weren't gone, but they were starting to come down bit by bit. And that was enough. The setback had shaken Juliet. It had reminded her of the painful reality of trying to heal deep wounds. Healing wasn't linear, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't going to happen all at once, no matter how much she wanted it to. But Juliet wasn't going to give up on them. She wasn't going to give up on the triplets. Even when they pushed her away, even when the progress felt small and fleeting, she knew that love wasn't just about fixing the pain. It was about showing up again and again, even when the setback seemed to win. And she wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever. The days after the setback were some of the hardest Juliet had faced since arriving at the mansion. The atmosphere had grown heavier again, as if the walls they had worked so hard to break down had risen back up higher than before. Daniel, Ava, and Caleb were once again retreating into their individual worlds, each one battling their own pain in silence. Juliet had to admit she felt disheartened. She had spent so much time trying to connect with them, trying to help them heal, but now it felt like all her efforts were in vain. But she wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't be. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. Healing, Juliet reminded herself, was never easy, and if it meant that she had to start again from square one, she would do it. She had always believed in the power of patience, and she had to trust that it would carry her through this difficult time. One morning, Juliet woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, and the air outside was cool and crisp. As she made her way downstairs, she noticed that the triplets' rooms were still locked, their usual morning rituals not yet begun. She couldn't force them to wake up, but she knew that there was something she needed to do, something that might get through to them, something they hadn't experienced before. Juliet went into the kitchen and started preparing a special breakfast. She didn't know exactly what she was hoping for, but she wanted to create a moment that might spark something in the triplets, a moment where they could come together, even if it was just for a few minutes. She didn't expect miracles, but she did believe in the power of small, meaningful moments. The smell of freshly baked pancakes, sizzling bacon, and warm coffee soon filled the house. It wasn't long before the triplets slowly made their way downstairs. Caleb was the first to emerge, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, glancing at the kitchen before slowly walking toward the table. Daniel followed behind him, his face still tight with tension. Ava was last, as usual, walking into the kitchen with a scowl on her face, arms crossed, looking more like a storm cloud than a person. Juliet didn't say anything at first. She simply smiled as she set the food on the table, letting the warmth of the meal fill the space between them. For a long moment, no one spoke. It felt like the quiet before a storm, but Juliet was patient. She knew that it would take time, but this moment was important. It wasn't about forcing conversation or trying to fix things immediately. It was about showing them that they didn't have to face the world alone. Finally, it was Caleb who broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, but Juliet could hear the sadness in it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his hands resting on the table. "I didn't mean to shut you out. I just don't know how to talk about it." Juliet's heart swelled with a mix of relief and tenderness. She didn't respond right away. She just sat there, letting the words hang in the air. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, Caleb," Juliet said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. But when you're ready, I'll be here." Ava scoffed, rolling her eyes. She didn't understand what Caleb was feeling. She didn't understand the pain that he was carrying. "I don't get why you all are acting like this," she muttered, slamming her hands on the table. "We're just broken, right? Just messed up. So, why are you still trying to help us?" Juliet looked at Ava, her expression calm but firm. "Because I see something in you, Ava. I see that you're more than your anger, more than the walls you put up to protect yourself. And I'm not going anywhere, no matter how hard you push me away." Daniel, who had been silent up until this point, spoke next. His voice was low, filled with emotion he rarely showed. "I don't know how to fix it, Juliet. I don't know how to fix myself." "You don't have to fix anything, Daniel," Juliet said softly, her voice full of warmth. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to take the first step, and we'll take it together." For a long moment, no one spoke. It felt like the air was thick with everything that had been left unsaid. But then something shifted. It wasn't immediate, but it was real. Daniel, Ava, and Caleb looked at each other for the first time in a long while. They weren't sure what to say, but Juliet could see that they were beginning to understand. Maybe they weren't perfect. Maybe they never would be. But they didn't have to be perfect to heal. Slowly, one by one, they began to eat. It was quiet at first, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet. A quiet that spoke of acceptance of the slow but steady process of healing. Juliet watched them, her heart full. They weren't there yet, but they were getting closer. The next few days brought more challenges, but also more small victories. Daniel, who had been withdrawn and distant, began to open up in little ways. He started joining Juliet in the garden again, not saying much, but staying by her side. Ava, though still full of fire and frustration, started showing signs of vulnerability. She didn't snap at Juliet as much, and there were moments when she didn't push her away. Caleb began to speak more, sharing small bits of his day with Juliet. He was still the quiet one, but he was slowly starting to trust her. Juliet knew that the healing wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that they were on the right path. It wasn't about fixing their problems right away. It was about showing them that they weren't alone, that they didn't have to carry their pain by themselves anymore. One evening, as they all sat together at dinner, Juliet felt a quiet sense of peace. They weren't perfect. They weren't healed, but they were together, and that was enough for now. It was the first time in a long while that the triplets weren't at odds with one another. It was the first time in a long while that the house felt like home. As the days turned into weeks, Juliet's belief in the power of love, patience, and understanding only grew stronger. She knew that the road ahead would be filled with ups and downs, but she was more certain than ever that they would heal together. The triplets weren't fixed yet, but for the first time, Juliet felt hopeful. There was still so much to learn, so much to work through, but they weren't facing it alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The weeks passed by with a gentle rhythm that was both unfamiliar and comforting to Juliet. The house no longer felt like a battleground, but a place where the triplets, in their own way, were learning how to trust again. Juliet had always believed in the power of love, patience, and time, but seeing those qualities take root in the triplets was something she would never take for granted. She had never imagined how transformative it would be, not just for them, but for her as well. At first, it had all been about the triplets. They were the focus, their healing, their growth, and their eventual acceptance of love. Juliet poured all of her energy into them, into showing them that they were not beyond repair, that they deserved to be loved, even in their brokenness. But as time went on, she realized something she hadn't anticipated. Her own heart was healing, too. Juliet had spent so many years running from her past, from the pain that had shaped her into the woman she was today. She had built walls of her own, walls that she didn't even realize were still standing until she had started to open her heart to the triplets. They had forced her to confront parts of herself that she had long buried, parts that still carried wounds of her childhood, from the loss of her parents, from the time she felt invisible in a world that didn't seem to care. But being there for the triplets, offering them the love and understanding they had been denied for so long, had begun to unlock parts of her that she had kept hidden for years. Juliet had never fully realized how much she had closed herself off until she started to care for them. And as the triplets changed, so did she. One afternoon, as Juliet walked through the garden, she noticed the bright flowers she had planted months ago beginning to bloom. The sight filled her with a quiet sense of pride. She had watched these flowers grow, nurturing them with care, just as she had done with the triplets. She had given them what they needed to grow, not just food or shelter, but the space to heal, to be themselves, and to learn how to trust again. And now, she was beginning to understand that the process of nurturing wasn't just something she did for others. It was something she needed for herself. Juliet stood still for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her as she took in the beauty of the garden. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived. She had changed, just as the triplets had. And yet, there was still so much she didn't understand about herself. She was still learning, still discovering the pieces of herself that had been hidden away for so long. It was in one of these quiet moments of reflection that Juliet realized just how far the triplets had come. The changes had been gradual, small at first, but they were undeniable. Daniel, who had once been so closed off, had started to engage more with her, even if only through simple gestures. He had been helping her with tasks around the house, small things like fixing a light bulb or carrying a box, but they were moments of connection, moments where he wasn't just watching from the sidelines but actively participating. He had begun to smile more, albeit subtly, but the change was there. Ava, too, had started to soften, though in her own fiery way. She still tested Juliet's patience, but she was less combative, less defensive. There were moments when Ava would sit down beside Juliet without saying a word, just sharing the quiet, and those moments meant more to Juliet than any grand gesture ever could. Ava was starting to see that being vulnerable didn't make her weak. It made her human. Caleb had made the most noticeable progress. He had always been the quiet one, the one who withdrew into himself, but over the past few weeks, he had begun to speak more. He would sit with Juliet in the evenings, asking questions about her life, about the things she liked to do, the things she had experienced. It wasn't much, but it was a breakthrough for him. He was learning to trust not just Juliet, but himself, and for that, Juliet felt a deep sense of pride. Juliet often found herself sitting in the evenings, reflecting on how far they had all come. There were still moments of tension, still times when the triplets would retreat into their old habits, but the progress they had made was undeniable. And through it all, Juliet had found something she hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. She had spent so much of her life feeling like an outsider, disconnected from the world around her. But here, in this mansion, with these 3 children who had been broken in ways she could understand, she had found a family, not a perfect one, but one that was real, one that was healing together. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Juliet found herself in the living room, sorting through some papers. The triplets were scattered around the room, each one doing their own thing. Daniel was reading a book, Ava was drawing a notebook, and Caleb was sitting by the window, looking out at the stars. For the first time in months, the house felt peaceful. There was no tension, no fighting, just a quiet hum of their presence. Juliet couldn't help but smile to herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. Daniel looked up from his book, his gaze meeting hers. "Thanks for not giving up on us," he said quietly. Juliet's heart swelled at the sincerity in his voice. She didn't know if he fully understood how much that meant, but the words were enough. "You're welcome, Daniel," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Ava looked up from her drawing, giving Juliet a look that was a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "You're not like the others, you know that?" she said, her voice almost too quiet to hear. Juliet's smile grew wider and she nodded. "I'm glad to hear that, Ava. I'm glad to be here." Caleb, who had been staring out the window, turned around and looked at Juliet with wide eyes. "I think I'm starting to understand," he said softly. "I think I can trust you." Juliet felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She didn't say anything for a moment, letting the meaning of his statement sink in. It was a small sentence, but it was everything. And in that moment, Juliet realized that healing wasn't just about what she could give to the triplets. It was about what they had given her, too. They had opened her heart in ways she hadn't thought possible, and for that, she would be forever grateful. The triplets still had a long way to go. They still had their struggles, their moment of doubt and fear. But Juliet had come to understand that healing didn't happen in a straight line. It wasn't about perfection or fixing everything. It was about showing up over and over again and offering love, even when it was hard. And she had learned that love, true love, was enough. The mansion had changed, transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The once cold, dark hallways were now filled with the warmth of shared moments. Silent understandings, quiet laughter, and the occasional argument that ended in reconciliation. The triplets, who had once seemed unreachable, were now learning to open up, to trust, and to heal. And Juliet, who had come to them as a stranger, had become something more, a mother, a guide, and a friend. The healing journey wasn't perfect, nor would it ever be. It was a road paved with setbacks, painful moments, and confusion, but it was also a road filled with love, compassion, and progress. Julia had learned that love didn't mean fixing people. It meant accepting them as they were, understanding their pain, and being there for them, no matter how long it took. That was the true power of love. Juliet stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over the mansion. The colors of the sky, soft pinks, fiery oranges, and deep purples, mirrored the transformation she had seen within the triplets. In the quiet of the garden, she reflected on everything that had happened. When she first walked through the doors of the mansion, the triplets were angry, closed off, and broken. They had hurt her without even realizing it. But now they had grown, not just in their understanding of themselves, but in their ability to trust, to accept love, and to offer in return. Daniel had changed the most. His cold exterior had softened, his walls coming down piece by piece. He no longer saw the world through eyes clouded with anger, and though he still struggled at times, he was no longer afraid to let people in. He had learned that he didn't have to be perfect to be loved. He was enough, just as he was. Ava, the wild child who had once rejected everything and everyone, had begun to soften as well. She no longer pushed people away with the same ferocity. She had learned that vulnerability didn't make her weak. It made her human. Ava still had her moments of defiance, her fiery nature, but those moments were now tempered with a deep understanding of herself and others. She had learned to trust, to let love in, and in turn, she had become more open and empathetic than Juliet had ever imagined. And Caleb, the quiet one, the one who had hidden away from the world for so long, was starting to find his voice. He spoke more often now, sharing bits and pieces of his world with Juliet. He wasn't as withdrawn, and he had learned to be honest with himself. He had learned that he didn't have to hide his pain or his fears, that by acknowledging them he could start to heal. Caleb wasn't perfect, none of them were, but that was okay. They were learning, and that was all that mattered. Juliet had done everything she could to help them, but in the process, they had helped her too. They had opened her heart, shown her that love wasn't just about giving. It was about receiving, about letting others in. For so long, she had kept herself closed off from the world, afraid to trust, afraid to get hurt again. But as she had helped the triplets, she had started to heal herself. They had taught her to be vulnerable, to accept the love she so freely gave. They had taught her that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, patience, and love. The triplets were still on their journey, still facing challenges, but they had come so far. Juliet had become part of their family, and she had found her place among them. The mansion, which had once felt like a cold, distant place, now felt like home. Not a perfect home, but a real one. A home built on love, understanding, and the willingness to be there for each other, no matter what. One evening, as the triplets sat around the dinner table, Juliet felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. The laughter, the shared moments, the way they had all come together. It was a far cry from the angry, broken children she had first met. They weren't healed completely. There would always be challenges, but there was hope now. There was light where once there had been only darkness. Daniel, who had been quiet throughout dinner, spoke up first. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come here, Juliet, but I'm glad you did." Ava, who had been playing with her food, looked up and nodded. "Yeah, me too," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I don't think we would have figured it out without you." Caleb, who had been looking out the window, turned and smiled at Juliet. "You made it okay to be us," he said softly. Juliet felt a lump form in her throat at their words. She didn't have to say anything. She didn't need to. She just smiled, a smile full of love and gratitude. These three children, no, young adults, had shown her more than she could have ever imagined. They had opened her heart, and in return, she had helped open theirs. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about all of them, healing together, growing together, and learning together. They weren't perfect, and they would continue to face challenges, but they had found something that could never be taken away. Love. And as long as that love was there, they could face anything. Later that night, as Juliet stood outside, gazing at the stars above, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The mansion no longer felt empty. It felt full of love, full of life, and full of the promise of tomorrow. Juliet had come to this place looking for something. She didn't know what, but she had found so much more than she ever expected. She had found a family, a real family. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Because, after all, that was what family did.